So when I stepped back, when my life began to look different from what people expected, they chose a word for me. They said I rebelled, but rebellion is loud. Rebellion is fueled by anger. Rebellion wants to be seen. What I did was none of those things. What I did was quiet. What I did was slow. What I did was necessary. My name is Jill Duggar, and this is not a story about rebellion. It's a story about recovery. I grew up in a world where obedience was the highest form of love, not just respect, not just cooperation, obedience. From a very young age, I learned that being good meant being agreeable. It meant smiling even when you were confused. It meant trusting authority even when your body felt tense. It meant believing that discomfort was something you prayed through, not something you questioned. In our home, faith shaped everything. It shaped our schedules, our clothing, our friendships, our futures. And I don't say that with bitterness. I say it as a fact. Faith gave us structure. It gave us purpose. It gave us language for sacrifice. But when faith is mixed with fear, something changes. Fear makes obedience urgent. Fear makes questions feel dangerous. Fear teaches you that safety comes from staying inside the lines, not from understanding why the lines exist. I didn't grow up thinking I need to escape. I grew up thinking I need to do this right. That mindset stays with you even as an adult, even after marriage, even when you leave the house. Marriage was supposed to be the moment everything settled. That's what I was taught. You grow up under authority, then you get married and life becomes clear. But real life isn't that simple. Marriage didn't erase my past. It didn't instantly heal my nervous system. It didn't suddenly teach me how to listen to my own needs. What marriage did do was give me space. Space I had never really had before. For the first time, I wasn't surrounded by constant noise and constant expectation. For the first time, my thoughts didn't have to compete with 15 other needs in the same room. And in that quiet, something unexpected happened. I noticed myself, not the version of me that performed well, not the version of me that kept peace, but the version of me that felt tired. I realized I had spent most of my life being strong without ever asking whether I was safe. That realization is unsettling because when you notice how tired you are, you also notice how long you've been tired. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to change everything. There was no dramatic moment, no slammed doors, no public declarations. There was just a slow awareness that something inside me needed care. People misunderstand that part. They assume distance means rejection. They assume boundaries mean punishment. They assume stepping back means judging others. For me, stepping back was about survival. I had to learn the difference between loyalty and self-erasure. I had to understand that love doesn't require constant access. I had to accept that being available to everyone can mean being absent from yourself. Those lessons don't come quickly when you've been taught that self-denial is holiness. For a long time, I thought discomfort meant I was doing something right, that if something hurt, it must be refining me. That rest was suspicious. But the body tells the truth even when the mind has learned to stay quiet. My body was tired. My thoughts were anxious. My emotions felt confusing instead of peaceful, and none of that made me weak. It made me human. Recovery doesn't look heroic. It looks boring from the outside. It looks like therapy appointments. It looks like learning new language for old feelings. It looks like realizing you don't actually know what you like because your preferences were never important before. It looks like guilt that doesn't go away right away. Guilt is powerful when you've been trained to associate it with love. I felt guilty for resting, guilty for saying no, guilty for not explaining myself. But guilt is not the same thing as conviction. That was a hard lesson. Conviction brings clarity. Guilt brings fear. And fear is not where healing grows. I didn't stop loving my family. I didn't stop valuing faith. I didn't become angry. I became honest about what I could handle, honest about what I needed, honest about what was no longer healthy for me. That honesty cost me misunderstanding. People prefer the version of you they can predict. When you change quietly without drama, it makes people uncomfortable because they don't know where to place you anymore. So they choose a label. She rebel. That label makes them feel safe. It simplifies something complex. But recovery is complex. Recovery means acknowledging that something hurt. Even if it was done with good intentions. Recovery means accepting that love and harm can exist in the same place. Recovery means choosing health without needing someone else to be wrong. I didn't need a villain to heal. I needed space. I needed to unlearn the idea that my worth was measured by how much I could endure. I needed to understand that boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks. You don't lock a door because you hate the world outside. You lock it because what's inside matters. That was a new way of thinking for me. I had to learn that saying no does not make you ungrateful. That stepping back does not mean stepping away from love. That rest is not rebellion. The hardest part of recovery is trusting yourself after years of being told not to, trusting your own judgment, trusting your own feelings, trusting that your body is allowed to signal danger or exhaustion. That trust doesn't come overnight. Sometimes it comes in small moments, like realizing you're allowed to change your mind, or noticing that your breathing feels calmer when you stop explaining yourself, or understanding that peace feels different from obedience. Peace is steady. Obedience, when fueled by fear, is tense. I didn't know that difference for most of my life. Learning it changed everything. And here's the part people don't always like hearing: recovery is not a statement. It's not an argument. It's not a message to anyone else. It's a responsibility to yourself. I didn't recover to prove anything. I recovered because I wanted to live a life that didn't require constant emotional armor. I wanted a faith that didn't rely on fear. I wanted relationships that could survive honesty. I wanted a nervous system that didn't feel like it was always bracing for impact. That desire doesn't make someone rebellious. It makes them awake. If you've ever been told that protecting yourself is selfish, if you've ever felt guilty for needing distance, if you've ever been labeled simply because your healing didn't look dramatic, I want you to know this. Quiet change is still change. Gentle boundaries are still boundaries. Recovery does not require permission. This is only the beginning of my story, not the version people invented, the version I lived. And in the next part, I want to talk about where all of this started, growing up under constant expectation and how that shaped the way I learned to survive. When people talk about pressure, they usually imagine something loud. Yelling demands obvious control, but the pressure I grew up with was quiet. It lived in expectations, in routines, in unspoken rules that didn't need repeating because everyone already knew them. From the time I was young, I understood that my role came with conditions. I wasn't just a daughter. I was an example. What I wore mattered. How I spoke mattered. What I questioned and what I didn't mattered. And the most important thing was this: never make things harder. That phrase shaped me more than I realized. Don't make things harder meant don't complain. Complain. It meant don't ask why when everyone else seems comfortable. It meant don't slow things down with your feelings. So I learned how to adapt. I learned how to read the room before I spoke. I learned how to anticipate what was expected and deliver it before anyone asked. I learned how to smile even when my chest felt tight. That kind of skill looks like maturity, but it's really hyper awareness. When you grow up constantly adjusting yourself to fit a system, you lose touch with what feels natural. I didn't know the difference between peace and performance. I thought they were the same thing. The structure of our life rewarded sameness. Sameness meant safety. Difference meant attention. And attention was risky. So I learned to be careful with my words, careful with my tone, careful with my curiosity. Curiosity can feel dangerous when you're taught that the answers are already settled. I didn't think of myself as restricted. I thought of myself as disciplined. That's how expectations work when they're normalized. You don't see them as pressure, you see them as character. But over time, that kind of pressure shapes how you relate to yourself. I stopped trusting my instincts. I stopped naming discomfort. I stopped believing that confusion was worth addressing. Instead, I prayed it away. I worked harder. I tried to be better. And when that didn't bring peace, I assumed the problem was me. That mindset doesn't disappear when you leave home. It follows you. It shows up in adulthood as anxiety, as guilt when you rest, as fear when you say no. It shows up as a voice that asks, are you being difficult? Even when you're simply being honest. Recovery later in life meant tracing those patterns back to their beginning, not to assign blame, but to understand why my nervous system responded the way it did. I wasn't broken. I was trained, and understanding that changed everything. Marriage is often described as a clean line between before and after. Before, authority rules childhood. After, freedom, adulthood. Clarity, that wasn't my experience. Marriage gave me distance from the system I grew up in, but it didn't automatically give me understanding. I carried my patterns with me. I still believe my value came from being agreeable. I still felt responsible for keeping everyone comfortable. I still struggled to recognize my own limits. What changed was that I finally had room to notice those patterns. Without constant oversight, my body reacted differently. Old anxieties surfaced. Unprocessed emotions appeared. That's when I realized something important. Obedience had taught me how to comply. It hadn't taught me how to regulate. Recovery meant learning things most people learn earlier: how to rest without guilt, how to disagree without panic, how to feel safe inside my own thoughts. Marriage didn't create my healing. It made it visible, and visibility can be uncomfortable, especially when people expect a transformation story that looks neat. Healing isn't neat. It's repetitive. It's slow. It involves revisiting memories you thought didn't matter, and sometimes it means stepping back from environments that keep triggering the same responses. That step wasn't dramatic. It was intentional. The first time I set a real boundary, I felt sick, not relieved, not empowered, guilty. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. Healthy boundaries don't feel wrong. They feel unfamiliar when you've never been allowed to have them. I had been taught that love meant access, that commitment meant availability, that loyalty meant endurance. So when I chose distance, even gentle distance, my body reacted as if I had done something terrible. That's not intuition. That's conditioning. Learning to tell the difference was part of recovery. Boundaries didn't make me colder. They made me clearer. And clarity is something fear can't survive. From the outside, distance looks like rejection. From the inside, it often looks like survival. I didn't step back to send a message. I stepped back to breathe. People filled in the silence with their own interpretations. That's what people do when they don't have access anymore. But recovery doesn't require an audience. It requires honesty. And sometimes honesty means choosing yourself even when it's misunderstood. When people imagine distance, they imagine and you're behind it. Raised voices, final words, burned bridges. But bitterness was the one thing I didn't want to carry with me. I had seen what bitterness does to people. It keeps you tied to the very thing you're trying to escape. It turns healing into an argument. I didn't want my life to become a reaction. So when I stepped back, I did it quietly, without speeches, without ultimatums, without trying to convince anyone that I was right. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was intentional. I was learning something new. You can change your proximity without changing your heart. Distance doesn't always mean disconnection. Sometimes it means regulation. I needed my nervous system to calm down before I could decide what I truly believed. I needed space where my thoughts could exist without being immediately corrected or interpreted. That kind of space feels unfamiliar when your life has always been communal. For a long time, my identity had been relational: daughter, sister, representative. Recovery meant becoming an individual without becoming isolated. That balance takes practice. I had to resist the urge to explain myself just to relieve other people's discomfort. I had to accept that being misunderstood was sometimes the price of being honest. And I had to make peace with the fact that not everyone would see my healing as valid. That doesn't make it less real. Bitterness asks you to keep score. Healing asks you to let go. I chose healing. One of the most important parts of my recovery happened away from cameras and conversations. It happened in rooms where I was allowed to speak freely, where my words weren't measured for impact, where my feelings weren't corrected with scripture or expectation. Therapy gave me language I didn't have before, language for boundaries, language for trauma responses, language for grief I didn't realize I was carrying. I learned that not all wounds come from cruelty. Some come from pressure. Some come from silence. Some come from being strong too early for too long. That understanding changed how I saw my past. I didn't need to rewrite it as evil to acknowledge it was heavy. I didn't need to assign blame to validate my pain. Healing became less about fixing something broken and more about caring for something tired. That distinction mattered. I wasn't trying to become someone new. I was trying to return to myself. For a long time, faith and fear lived very close together in my mind. Faith meant certainty. Fear meant consequences. I didn't know how to separate them. Recovery didn't remove my faith. It refined it. I began to ask different questions. Not, is this allowed? But is this healthy? Not, will this look obedient? But will this bring peace? Faith stopped being a performance and became a relationship. A quieter one, a more honest one. I learned that God is not threatened by questions, that belief does not collapse when certainty softens, and I learned that fear is not a spiritual fruit. Peace is. Letting go of fear-based faith felt risky at first, but what replaced it was something steadier: trust. People often asked why I didn't speak sooner, why I didn't clarify, why I didn't correct the narrative. The answer is simple: I was still listening. You can't tell a story clearly while you're still surviving it. You can't explain boundaries before you understand them yourself. Silence gave me time to integrate what I was learning, to feel without defending, to heal without performing. Speaking too early would have turned recovery into content. I didn't want that. I wanted my voice to come from wholeness, not reaction. Silence wasn't avoidance, it was preparation. And now, When I speak, I do it without urgency, without fear, without needing approval, because recovery gave me something rebellion never could: peace with myself. For a long time, I believed safety came from doing things the right way, following the rules, meeting expectations, avoiding conflict. But real safety is something you feel in your body, not something you perform. Recovery taught me that safety and silence are not the same thing. In a healthy marriage, I learned that my voice didn't need to be softened to be accepted. That disagreement didn't threaten love. That rest didn't need justification. Self-respect wasn't something I had to demand. It was something I practiced. It showed up in small choices. Choosing honesty over harmony, choosing rest over explanation, choosing to listen to discomfort instead of spiritualizing it away. That shift didn't make me less loving. It made me more present. I stopped confusing endurance with devotion. I stopped believing that suffering was proof of faithfulness. And I learned that a life built on safety grows stronger than a life built on fear. Once someone labels you, they expect consistency. When I was labeled the rebel, people waited for anger, for bitterness, for dramatic distance. But none of that came, because the label was never accurate. Letting go of it meant accepting that I didn't need to correct everyone's assumptions. I didn't need to defend my choices. I didn't need to prove that I was still good, faithful, or kind. I stopped trying to manage my image. Recovery gave me permission to be misunderstood without being unsettled by it. That freedom is quiet, but it's powerful. I am no longer the version of myself that survives by compliance. I am someone who chooses with clarity. Not everyone will understand that shift, and that's okay. My life doesn't need consensus to be meaningful. If there's one thing I hope people take from my story, it's this: recovery is not rebellion. It doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be angry. It doesn't have to reject everything that came before it. Recovery can be gentle. It can be faithful. It can be slow. It can look like stepping back instead of storming out, like choosing peace instead of proving a point, like healing without turning your life into an argument. I didn't recover to send a message. I recovered to live, to breathe without guilt, to trust my body, to believe that God's presence doesn't disappear when fear does. My story isn't about breaking away. It's about becoming whole. And if you're listening to this while quietly changing your own life, setting boundaries that others don't understand, choosing healing that doesn't come with applause, I want you to know something. You're not late. You're not weak. You're not rebelling. You're recovering. And that may be the bravest thing you ever do.